Intermittent fasting, the spiritual and physical significance. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Polypat. I know Eric usually does the intro, so sorry you had to start with my annoying voice, but
I
brother,
think you
good
have
to
a
be
great
with
voice.
you. Yeah, good. Yeah, sorry if my audio quality isn't as good. My microphone just broke, so I'm using the AirPods, but I'll try to speak as clearly as I can. I should have a new microphone next week.
Yes. Well, I'm excited to talk about this with you because you wrote a book about fasting for dummies, right?
Right. Yeah. So many years ago, for people who don't know, I was a For Dummies author for a number of years. They were the first publishing company I was with. My first book was on kettlebells. They all have terrible titles. They've done well in spite of their terrible titles. The first one was called Paleo Workouts for Dummies, and this was, if everyone remembers, the paleo diet. Remember the height of the paleo craze?
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I was in talks with the publisher at the time of doing this book kind of on kettlebells, and they said, well, why don't we call it paleo workouts? I'm like, I don't know what a paleo workout is, but I'll write a book on kettlebells and you can call it whatever you want. So I did argue with them, like, don't call it paleo because in 5 years from now paleo is going to be done, and I was right. Right. But yeah, so the book is about, kettlebell body weight training. It's really just kind of an intro to kettlebell and strength training, that book. Then the second one I wrote was on intermittent fasting. So I have the For Dummies book on intermittent fasting, which is called Fast Diets for Dummies, which I think is also another not great title. And I said, kind of funny actually, to related to our topic, I said, well, why don't we just call it, fasting for dummies, right? Like, doesn't that make sense? And they said that sounded too religious.
Oh.
And I'm like, well, what
Wow.
about it? And I'm like, well, what about intermittent fasting for dummies? And they're like, well, that sounds too complicated. I'm like, okay. And they're like, well, what about fast diets for dummies? I'm like, well, that
That
doesn't
sounds
sound
like
like
a
anything.
quick diet.
What does that mean, right? So I don't know. This is the, I guess one of the things of working with a publisher, right? You don't always have as much creative control as you want. So it was called Fast Diets for Dummies. It is called. You can still get it. And it's really an introduction to intermittent fasting. And this was before I was Catholic. This was before I was religious. So I was really just interested in it from like the pure physiology side of things. What are the health
Mhm.
benefits? What are the benefits for body composition, and what are some of the different ways to go about it? So yes, that was my second published book. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah, and as a Christian and now as a Catholic as well, I mean, just fasting has a huge religious importance. And so it's interesting how the science now is kind of backing up the health benefits, like physical health benefits of fasting. But for a long, long time, the spiritual benefits have certainly been a motivation for Christians to fast. I will say personally, and I think there's a lot of Christians out there like me, that fasting is the hardest spiritual discipline. I actually think it helps to know the health benefits so that when you're in like the trenches of fasting, you are extra motivated maybe by that, and that's okay. And I think that has helped me actually um, try to get better at fasting as well. Just knowing, okay, this actually does have health benefits as well. So that's kind of a bonus. But obviously, the spiritual benefits are even more important.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to talk about all that today. And so first of all, maybe just going over a few preliminary scriptures that I think are important. Jesus' own teaching on fasting. He says on the Sermon on the Mount, and when you fast, do not look gloomy as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces so that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that your fasting may not be seen by other people, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And you should note that Jesus says when you fast. It's not if. And so fasting is an expectation that will be part of the normal Christian life. And liturgically, we see that in the season of Lent, and then every Friday throughout the year, we see fasting, and in the season of Advent as well. Fasting is part of the rhythm of the church's life. But it's important not to do it to be seen by other people, but seriously to connect with the Father and to do it in that secret place. And I think since becoming Catholic, a huge thing to, I guess, connect it to is the idea of redemptive suffering as well. So obviously, it's a way of being penitent. It's a way of the Catechism says in paragraph 2043, it helps us acquire mastery over our instincts and freedom of heart. And so it has those benefits spiritually of like, you don't want to be mastered by your passions, by your appetites. You want to be the master over them, and fasting helps you do that, to where you're not just a slave to your appetites, but you are the master of them.
Yeah, so all really good stuff there, and it is interesting. Yeah, so we don't have like a direct commandment from our blessed Lord of thou shalt fast, on this day or that day. It really is it's just assumed. It's just an expectation, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's very important. And so yes, there is biblical support, obviously, and great support in both tradition and the teachings of the church for the many benefits of fasting. But you highlighted one, which is really helping us to develop in virtue, right? So fasting, it
Yes.
falls under the umbrella of various forms of ascetic practices. And asceticism, the case for asceticism is this: you set up a sort of set of artificial conditions that helps to train you in the dispositions that facilitate virtue, because we know that virtue is often the ability to make prudent judgments under times of stress, when there are competing interests, passions, desires, appetites, etc. So the idea of asceticism is kind of like setting up again, a sort of set of artificial conditions, right? Because we're under control of it. We can impose them ourselves, or we can lift them ourselves, to really train ourselves in a way that hopefully that we'll be ready for and capable of overcoming non-artificial conditions, natural conditions, where we might find ourselves in periods of temptation of various sorts.
It's interesting. There was a guy years and years ago, before I was Catholic. He was a charismatic, and not that you can't be Catholic and charismatic, but this guy was not Catholic, but he was charismatic. And he said he fasted, like we were just talking about. He wasn't boasting in his fasting, but I was like, so yeah, why do you fast? He's fasted twice a week, which interestingly enough, the earliest Christians that earliest Christian document that we have, the Didache, one of the earliest Christian documents that we have outside of the New Testament, written in the first century, talks about that the early Christians fasted every Wednesday and Friday, every week, Wednesday and Friday. And I think that's a great discipline that I highly recommend for our listeners. But anyway, this guy fasted twice a week. I don't know if it was Wednesdays and Fridays, but fasted twice a week and did some other fasting. I was like, yeah, what like motivates you, man? He was like on it, and he's not a conspiracy theorist by any means, but he's seeing the times, the signs of the times, right? And he's like, things are going down in America. Like, we're going to be facing religious persecution, and I want to be ready. So like, if I'm put into a concentration camp, let's say, or if I'm put into a place where like I'm starving, I'll have fasted beforehand, so I'm strong enough when that happens to not give into my temptations then. I was like blown away. I was like, that's a pretty amazing mindset, to be in that state of being training and training right now for those trials that are coming. And I think that's something we have to keep thinking about as well as Christians, is just like, we are soldiers for Christ. We are in the church militant, and we got to train ourselves to have virtue, so that when those trials and tribulations come, we can overcome them and resist our own impulses. And so it isn't easy. Fasting is not easy. I mean, like I said, it's the hardest one I think there is. You have prayer, almsgiving, and you have fasting. Those are kind of the classic three things that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount. And it's interesting too, on a spiritual level, in Mark 9, verse 29, he says, so he just cast out a demon from this kid, this mute and deaf demon. The disciples couldn't cast this demon out. And so Jesus is like, you faithless generation, all these things. And he cast the demon out eventually. And the disciples are like, hey, Jesus, why weren't we able to do that? And Jesus said, well, this one only can come out through prayer and fasting. And that phrase "and fasting" is actually not in some of the early manuscripts, but it is in other manuscripts. But anyway, I digress. Some demons can only be cast out through prayer and fasting. So there's this extra like power that comes with fasting. I think it's just this denial of self, and I guess it just helps you carry that extra anointing, that extra power. And so that's interesting when we're talking about deliverance and like making an impact and really progressing the spiritual life. Some things like we need to fast in order to progress in that way, in that direction. And so I'm thankful that the church does prescribe, obviously Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, we have to fast. And then we're penitential, well, really on every Friday during Lent. And then every Friday, even throughout the year, we're supposed to have some sort of penance, be penitential, because that was the day our Lord died. And so there's lots of reasons for that. But I love that there is fasting incorporated into the church's life there.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the idea of asceticism, the rational case for it is that we are rational animals, but we're animals. So there's competing appetites, competing temptations,
Yes.
pulls towards, of course, sexual desires, but food as well, which can enroll us in vice, gluttony, for example, stuff like that, right? So it's true that virtue is its own reward. It's how we flourish, but virtue is both a means and an end. It's also how we conform ourselves to Christ and God's love, right? When we don't resist the Spirit's call, when we let God work within us, He's calling us to a life of virtue. Virtues are they're just perfections of our powers. They're perfections of the powers that are proper to us that cause us to be most excellent, be most alive.
Mm-hmm.
So the wisdom in asceticism is making sure that we're training ourselves to be properly ordered, that reason is guiding the other appetites. That's what ascetic practices like fasting help us to do, to break away from the vicious habits, or to create space between the certain appetites and our response to them. And we can do that. You can do that gradually, of course. If you never fasted before, we want to kind of take small steps. Same thing like with the gym, right? You have these different virtues of like temperance and fortitude, and I actually think like fasting and exercise kind of correspond nicely to each of these, because temperance is, of course, being able to, in a loose sense, saying no to certain temptations, of understanding how to moderate our appetites, just not overdo it, in a sense. Whereas fortitude is pushing through tough things to a worthy end. So fasting requires both temperance and fortitude. But same thing, but I sometimes think of temperance more with fasting, and like fortitude more in the gym. So there's diet and exercise, right? It's kind of
Yes.
a fun way to think about how these can be more than just about vanity, right? Right. And that's what we don't want. We don't want to be just dieting or exercise just to be vain. That actually would be vicious. But if we're using approaches to nutrition and or whatever we do in the gym to try and increase in virtue, well, now we're really pushing ahead to our flourishing. We might be doing it under artificial condition, things that we're imposing upon ourselves. That's sort of the rational case for asceticism, that it's a sort of training, in a sense, that
Yeah.
should the hard times come, and let's be honest, the hard times are every day we face temptations, regardless of mass scale religious persecution. We're always tempted by something
Mm-hmm.
in an order that is against our proper flourishing. So you're right, it's God's church. Of course she's going to be wise. And so it doesn't surprise me that now all the science that we've had in the past 20 years, really, there's been a lot of good research on intermittent fasting, is just confirming the wisdom of fasting that the church is taught. Obviously not so much on a spiritual level, but at least on a health level, the physiology of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I definitely want to dig into that. And it reminded me of St. Paul uses the analogy that we're athletes for Christ as well, and that athletes, think about how much they do to compete for an earthly crown that withers and fades, but we compete for an eternal crown of glory. And the road is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, Jesus says, and those who find it are few. And so it's like, when you think about how much time people spend on things that they care about, like maybe their career or working out, let's say, or like looking good. Okay, well, but number one is your relationship with God. Number one is your spiritual life. And all of a sudden, when you get into like, do you have a rhythm of prayer? Oh, don't be so religious. Or do you have any fasting? Well, don't put that on me. It's like, but don't you believe in like training, like for athletic events or like marathons? Or don't you believe that it takes work sometimes to be excellent at things in life? Why would it be different in the spiritual life? Like, it takes work. You reap what you sow. And so start sowing in the Spirit and you'll reap in the Spirit. And I think it's good to be reminded that it's hard work being a Christian. And, Paul even says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for God is at work in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. And so it does take work. Fasting is work, but I think something that helps. Yeah. I think something that helps is knowing the science behind it.
No, yeah. So there's a kind of a slogan going around by a guy named Jocko Willink. It's called discipline equals freedom, right? And I would say that's utterly Catholic, right? So the idea is that freedom isn't just autonomous self-direction, right? It's not just being able to choose whatever you want. That's the wrong conception of freedom. Freedom is not being bound down by something that is restricting you from flourishing and being the most excellent kind of thing that you are, right? So like a plant is free. We would say that plant is free when it's not like bound down by something artificial. Well, same thing for us. If we get bound down by vicious habits, temptations, appetites, that we become both physically and spiritually sick, sure, we might be able to choose different things. We might still have autonomous self-direction. We would say, yeah, you're really not free. You're a slave to bad habits, right?
Yes.
And that's what Jocko's getting at. And there's a reason people resonate with Jocko, because he's just getting at a perennial Catholic insight.
Yep.
And the idea behind discipline equals freedom is that it takes work to develop virtue, right? Virtues are just habits. They're just good habits, where vices are habits too. They're just bad habits.
Yeah. Habits of doing good.
Right. So yeah, it's just interesting to me, because like here's a guy who's mostly in the secular world that's saying something that is just, this is the Catholic Church has said this forever, guys.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, good. I just heard a thing in my ear. Did my headset die? Can you still hear me?
No.
Okay?
I can hear you.
Okay, cool. So yeah, physical benefits. Let me just list some of the obvious ones real quick. I'm actually writing another like short little ebook where I'll have a bunch of footnotes and references. It will be called Introduction to Fasting.
Nice.
So the kind of obvious ones: weight loss. Yes, fasting has been demonstrated to be, at the very least, fasting has been shown to be just as effective as any other form of traditional calorie control. So like you're no worse off practicing fasting than doing any other diet. And there's other evidence to suggest that it might be superior in some ways, but definitely weight loss is a benefit. Improved body composition. There's some studies to show that fasting might have a muscle sparing effect. So it might be actually preferable for people who care specifically about losing weight and retaining muscle. Fasting has shown promise and positive evidence for any number of health issues concerning inflammation, oxidative stress, triglycerides. And it also shows in a number of studies that it has really good dietary compliance too, which is a key thing. So if you're just looking at it from a pure nutritional standpoint, it's got all these benefits. It tends to be quite effective for weight loss. But it also tends to have good adherence, good compliance as well, which is what we want to see for nutrition protocols.
What do you mean by good compliance?
So good compliance is when they have these studies, they see like how many people actually stick with it, right?
Oh, okay.
So a higher compliance means more people were actually able to follow through and stick with it.
Gotcha.
Yeah, because there's one thing to have a diet that like, sure, it works, right? But it might just be utterly impractical for people. Fasting has shown that it's actually seems to be quite practical, something that people are totally capable of achieving.
Now, and there's different levels of fasting. I'm sure you reap different benefits depending what way you fast. So like, one thing I'd like to know about, so the minimum requirement for, like, if you were to fast for a day, like the minimum that the Catholic Church says as far as religious fasting would be like 2 small meals that don't equal a full meal and then 1 full meal. And that's like, if you do that in one day, like you're fasting. That's like minimum. But obviously like the normal fasting would be like just drink water and don't eat anything. And that's fasting. Like, right?
It's just called don't eat, right? That's really it. Yeah.
And, but then we have the intermittent fasting, which is interesting. So maybe that's like, you just don't eat for 18 hours or whatever it might be. You skip breakfast. So you eat everything in like an 8-hour window. And so what are the benefits of that versus, I mean, are there any health benefits to the Catholic minimal fasting? And then
yes,
also
there totally are. Yeah.
How
so
many
the short
days?
answer, the short answer is a lot of the benefits that we see in fasting in the studies that have done can occur within the first 16 hours. So you don't actually need to do like
Oh,
long extended fasts to reap the benefits of fasting. Some of these benefits start kicking in sooner than people might expect. So yes, there is uh, specific health benefits to the Catholic minimal fast. Now remember, in terms of like weight loss and stuff like that, um, all else equal, right? If you just do the Catholic minimal fast, all else equal, you'll be dropping your calories and you'll lose weight, right? As long as you're not
yeah.
compensating in some other way. You might drop, who knows how much it is, maybe 500 calories a week, but that's going to add up. You'll see a difference from that, right?
Yeah.
Mhm. So I want to encourage people, like, don't feel like you have to start. I actually would prefer people kind of start with a more reasonable approach, because it's like exercise, right? If you've never done serious exercise and you go and try and do like a marathon or a CrossFit competition, you're going to feel terrible, right? You're going to feel awful. You might be discouraged. Whereas if you go, you challenge yourself, but you're largely successful, that can be empowering and motivating. So the Catholic fast is interesting because that actually corresponds with something that was pretty popular a number of years ago, and I still think it's a good approach. It's called the 5-2 fast. And the 5-2 fast, like, you think they would almost just get this from the Catholic Church, right? 2 days a week, you just have two small meals, and that's it. So like
Ah,
you would skip breakfast, right? So you would kind of skip breakfast, maybe have like an intermittent fasting. Maybe your first meal is lunch, and it's a lighter meal, so maybe it's just like a bowl of soup or a salad, and you have one kind of smaller meal for dinner or something like that. So you eat lighter overall that day. You kind of fast through the morning, and you have two small meals, and you just do that twice a week. And then everything else is just, you still try to eat normally and healthily the other days, but you're not fasting. That's pretty close to the Catholic recommendation, right?
yeah.
You maybe you're eating a little bit more with the Catholic one, but the Catholic one is you can have two smaller meals that add up to the larger, but you don't have to have them, right? You can
Yeah.
do a longer fast.
That's just the
Um,
minimum of like what, yeah, like when you think about fasting, what is the bare minimum that I can do to still qualify as fasting, I guess. And then
right.
anything beyond that is great. Like, but that way everyone kind of has a very clear, like, this is at least what you got to do.
Yeah. And then there's different forms of, what's called intermittent fasting. So sometimes one is just you hinted at just the basic, hey, maybe once or twice a week, you just don't eat. And the best way, the most practical way to do this would be like a dinner to dinner fast. So if I stopped eating tonight at 6 p.m., then I just wouldn't eat until tomorrow at 6 p.m. And that's good. That's a good solid fast. If you do that once a week, twice a week, if you're a real champion, you're going to notice some benefits from that. It's definitely more challenging, but I think it's worth doing at least occasionally.
Now, Pat, what about someone like me who I'm a pretty skinny guy, actually? I don't know if you can tell that on this video, but I mean, I'm not skinny. I'm pretty muscular. So watch out, everyone. But I don't want to lose weight. Like
Mhm.
I want to just maintain. And so, and some people are so skinny, like I'm not like this, but some people are so skinny where it's like, dang, if you lose weight, that's kind of dangerous. Or even like there's a lot of people that struggle with eating disorders. Like how would fasting play into that as well? So like, I there's one benefit to fasting that I've heard about, that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but basically, let's say you did a 5-day fast of just drinking water, then it would be starting on day 3. Day 4 really is really when you start getting the effect of this, and then day 5 as well. So which means you really have to fast for the full time, is this thing called autophagy, where your good cells are now basically eating your bad cells. And so if you had any precancerous stuff going on or any other immune things, this can really help because, and so even if you're skinny and don't want to lose weight, this is a diet that would actually be good because it's just like cleansing out the system basically. And then it would actually take longer than the first 16 hours, I guess, to see the effect of autophagy, or like to reap the full benefits of that. So any comments there about all those
Yeah,
different things
so
I just said?
autophagy is right. And so when I said that many, but not all of the benefits
Yeah.
occur in 16 hours, I forget what the research says on autophagy specifically. It is true. It is a real process, right? It's the cellular, that's a tough word to say, waste removal process, right? And same thing, very, very good therapeutic effects for the brain. My intuition, and I have to look back on the research on this because I did write about this in my fasting book when I was researching this originally. I would say that it's probably definitely long before a 5-day fast that a lot of that stuff starts kicking in. However, and they have had, don't have the studies off the top of my mind right now, but I think they have done some research of showing the potential benefits of being fasted, especially for people who are undergoing chemotherapy and stuff like that.
Yes, yes, yes.
Uh-huh. Again, worth looking into. I just don't have this. It's been a while, so I don't have the studies off the top of my mind. But yeah, that's all true stuff. I just forget the particular boundaries of when those benefits kick in and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Um, Now, as for eating disorders, yeah, this is something. Obviously, this is one of those things you have to keep in mind. If you struggle with eating disorders, it's very easy to kind of um, reignite, if that's the right word, or rationalize your eating disorder by finding a new dietary protocol. So if you know you've had issues with eating disorders, just as you would want to be cautious with beginning any new dietary protocol, you would want to be cautious with intermittent fasting as well. So that's just something that's just gonna be the case for some people. But if that isn't an issue with you, then um, then it's not like fasting will give you an eating disorder. Now,
Yeah.
I want to be clear. There is kind of a chicken and egg thing here. Very severe, you know, a lot. If you diet in a really intense way for a long time, that can cause a certain number of conditions of stress that you could develop an eating disorder from that, right?
Yeah.
That does happen. So it's what I mean is a chicken and the egg is like if you have eating disorders, you might feed that with fasting, so the eating disorder leads people to fast. But also, if you diet too intensely for too long, you could develop an eating disorder. And
Hmm.
there's research on that. So just things to be aware of. The fasting that I would recommend for most people, it's very reasonable. We would not be pushing your body into prolonged states of metabolic stress. That I think that would be a worry. Mhm.
Yeah. And what about someone who is on the skinnier side and doesn't really want to lose weight, but like, how would you maybe pitch fasting to them?
Right. Yeah. So I would say like this: make sure you eat plenty of protein and lift weights, and you'll be good.
All right.
So lift weights, the muscle stimulus, resistance training, and getting an adequate protein intake. Yeah, you probably won't like gain a bunch of weight, but you'll at least retain and maybe even develop some good muscle. So you'll look good,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, the weight training and the protein intake are going to be important if you want to just because fasting is quite effective for weight loss, and that's my issue. I'm good at fasting. I have the habit of fasting, so it's very easy for me to stay lean because I fast so much. And the key is I just have to make sure I'm lifting weights, doing my resistance training, and eating enough protein. Mhm.
Now, do you recommend even doing like lifting weights while fasting?
Yeah, occasionally I would. At some point, if you're fasting very frequently and you're lifting weights, you'll suffer some performance hits from that. Your glycogen will be lower, and you just won't have as much juice in the tank. So I typically enjoy maybe working out fasted once or twice a week. Um, More on the conditioning side. When it comes to the heavier strength training, where I really feel like I'm gonna have a hard workout, I typically prefer that's on a day when I'm not fasting. So it's something
Right.
that you can kind of have a both and with. Mhm.
Now there's, a lot of different people recommend different things. Like there's a guy named Dr. Peter Attia. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he is doing a lot of tests on like his own body basically. Like he'll do a 7-day fast, like just water, basically once a month, a 7-day fast. And like he's like looking at the benefits of that and everything. But what kind of fasting would you say, like, for most people, hey, this would be such a good fast like to do? Maybe it's the twice a week thing, maybe it's like an everyday intermittent thing, or and so yeah, what kind of fasting would you just recommend? And you could
Yeah,
do different levels for different people, I guess. Like,
yeah, I
but
would say I would say two starting options. One is the 5-2, or the Catholic fast is great, right? Like if
yeah,
you're just totally starting out, Wednesday and Friday, skip breakfast, have the one or two smaller meals, and then just have like a normal healthy dinner. There you go. Just like don't complicate it. Keep it
yeah,
simple. If you wanted to do kind of the you hinted at this, we could call the eating window approach. That's where you just have a certain amount of time. Popular approach is like 8 hours. So you have like an 8-hour eating window every day, and you just that's when you do your
Pig
eating.
out. Yeah.
And and try not to go overboard, right? So just eat normally in there, because it is obviously possible that you could overcompensate and have more calories in that window than you otherwise would. In that case, you're defeating the purpose, right? So yeah, just eat normally in that time period, and whatever that eating window is, that's restricted. So it's just that 8-hour eating window. You can move it around if you want. And you could do that every day, or maybe you just do that a few days a week. So I would say between those two approaches would be a good way to just get started and feel that. And then, I'm a minimum effective dose kind of guy, at least for the physical benefits. Spiritual, we can talk about that. It might be worth doing more there sometimes. But for the physical benefits, find something that you get into a rhythm with. The 5-2, the eating window, sometimes also called the 16-8, because you fast for 16 hours, eat for 8 hours. Start with one of those, see how it feels, lock it in, and you might realize that might be all you need. You might not need any more than that.
Now, at what point would you say, I mean, obviously we see Jesus fasting for 40 days with just water. You see Moses doing that. You see different saints throughout history fasting for long periods of time. Even people today, I mean, I don't know anyone off the top of my head, but I've heard of different people that have fasted for like 40 days. And so what would you recommend for someone who's, okay, I want to go on a multi-day fast. And at what point would you try to maybe discourage them from doing more than a certain amount of days, unless they could really hack it? Or I don't know if you have any thoughts, or like, man, that would be crazy if you did any longer than this. But I don't know if you have any recommendations with like a longer just water fast. Yeah, and I think I can't hear you there, Pat. Did your headphones go out? Well, we lost Pat Flynn for a second, but he's going to come back. He's going to come back in all of his glory, and I can predict what he's going to tell us. He's going to say, maybe fast for 3 days, or this is what I would say. I would say fast for 3 days, do a 3-day fast, and then maybe a 4-day, and then maybe a 5-day, and see how that goes. Obviously, seeking medical help is huge as well, and so that's going to be, doctors' opinions and all of that, and just having that medical supervision along with this as well is really huge. And so Pat is back.
I'm back. Hey, sorry about that. My headphones totally ran out of battery finally. So
it's okay.
Can you hear me okay still?
Yes. So I was just blabbing on there about my own recommendation. Basically, I was saying maybe start with a 3-day or 4-day or 5-day. And then I think anything beyond that, really, maybe even a 7-day, but anything beyond that, I would say have like medical supervision if you're going to do anything longer and just doing a water fast. Obviously, you can do other things. You can like do juices or whatever for a long time, but I'm just talking about good old fashioned water. Maybe you eat some salt or something too, because that can help. But any recommendations with like a longer fast?
I think you hit it. I mean, be reasonable. Get your doctor's approval, obviously, before you begin. And if you're going to do a longer fast, it helps if you have some shorter fasts under your belt as well, right? Like it's like running, right? If you're going to do a marathon, like I hope you've been doing some training beforehand, my friend, right?
Yes.
It's not something that's just easy to dive into. So, start reasonably, build up, and then if you feel that you can go for a longer fast, go for it, right?
Yeah. Well, hey, I think we covered a lot of ground today. I think we talked a little bit about the physiological benefits and the spiritual benefits. And I'm glad we're doing this because I'm doing a series right now on the rosary on my podcast. So that's the prayer part. Now we're hitting the fasting. So, man, everyone out there, you can pray and fast now and and go from glory to glory. And
it feels good, like exercise. It's one of those things that, like, you don't really like it at first, but then you get in the habit, and then then it feels weird if you don't do it, right? So I'm fasted right now. I'm hungry. I'm looking forward to dinner, but you kind of feel cool being hungry. You kind of like on the hunt,
Yeah.
And you start to actually develop a new relationship with hunger, whereas hunger doesn't freak you out anymore. It's not like, oh, I need to eat. Like, it's something that you can be comfortable with being somewhat uncomfortable.
Yes.
which is, again, it speaks to that idea of the value of ascetic practices. So don't let your first impression make you think that that's what it's always going to be like, right? Because it won't. Like you'll develop the habit, and what's very difficult at first eventually will become something you can do with relative ease. You'll still have your challenges, but you'll get stronger. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in today, and let's pray and fast together, especially for the salvation of the world, because our world is in need of more prayer and more fasting. And, it's also a form of penance. And there's a lot of repentance that needs to happen, I think, in America and throughout the world right now. And obviously in our own lives, right? Like we can always be repenting, I think, either for our own sins or on behalf of our country or the world. So enjoy that. Enjoy fasting, even if it's tough.
Amen.